Okay, so Robert Mace is not here. You get me instead. I'm sorry. So I'm going to work my way over there, and I'm going to put on my Robert Mace, start channeling my inner Robert Mace. Oh, it's fine. It is fine. Okay. Yes, this is channeling my inner Robert Mace. We're going to set my little kitty right here. I don't know how many of you know Robert Mace, but he likes his cats. And since he can't be with us, this is how I decided he could maybe join us in spirit. Listen to our conversation about correlative rights. So yes, Julia and I love coming up with catchy titles for presentations and panels. We, however, did not come up with this one. It was all Robert. But it was a good one. We loved it. We're sorry he's not here. We've got some great panelists, though, and I think we'll still have an excellent discussion. Okay, let me get organized. Okay, so we've got on our panel, sitting next to me here, James Beach, who many of you have worked with over the years. He's a principal at Advanced Groundwater Solutions. He's here to provide a technical perspective to our discussion. Next to him is Kelley Cochran. She's the general manager at Guadalupe County Groundwater Conservation District. Next, we have Britney Britten, the general manager at Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District. As John Dupnick said, our practitioner perspective from the two of them. And then on the far end, Kristen Fancher with Fancher Legal to provide that legal perspective for us. Okay, so purpose of our session today, to have a discussion on the use of correlative rights in Texas. I think we can do it with this star-studded panel. And Robert wanted me to share a little caveat, and I'm just going to read this. Although the title of this panel suggests that correlative rights might be wrong, that's not the intent. It might not be right for everyone based on a number of factors, but it might be an option for districts to consider more seriously, especially as a way to protect private property rights, where every landowner gets assigned their fair share. Our speakers today are going to help flesh this out, what it is, some pros and cons. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you right away, James, and say, let's set the stage. What are correlative rights?
Okay, so as a technical person, I should probably let the lawyer answer this from a legal perspective, but basically just a water right that's tied to an acreage or a land area in the simplest terms.
Kristen, would you add anything to that?
I think that's great, James. You can tell you've been around the lawyers a lot with that response, so I think it's a great one. Absolutely, and I will say the concept of correlative rights is actually rooted in general U.S. groundwater law. So what's funny about the way we do it in Texas and the way we think of it, it's different than in other states, where in some states they have an on-tract use requirement related to correlative rights versus an off-track. We do that different, obviously, with transport permits and things like that in Chapter 36. So I just wanted to mention on top of that, it is this concept that we borrowed essentially from this other law in the United States as it developed over the years.
Thanks for that, Kristen. So Robert had divided correlative rights into two categories: correlative rights light and correlative rights heavy. So he considers and views these correlative rights light as where the right is serving to limit how much can be pumped from a piece of property, but it's disconnected from the MAG. In other words, if you just add the acreage together and you multiply it by the correlative right, say it's 2 acre-feet per acre, it's not necessarily going to add up to the MAG. Correlative rights heavy, this approach is where the correlative right would serve as a limit on how much can be pumped from a piece of property, but it's connected to the MAG. In that sense, it is related to and derived from the total volume of groundwater that is available. So those were the concepts that kind of got him, I think, thinking about this panel and what he wanted to explore with you all. I'm just going to stop really quickly. I'm catching a bit of an echo, but I don't know if it's just us up on the stage or if it's something that the audience hears as well. No? Okay. All right. Good deal. We'll just go with it. So, Kristen, before we talk about correlative rights, that is one approach that districts can use. Can you talk a little bit about the suite of various permitting approaches that districts can use under Chapter 36?
Right, so just like I mentioned before with correlative rights being a borrowed concept, that's actually what's in 36, and Chapter 36 of the Texas Water Code. And it's actually in 36116A2, And there's a list. What our legislature did is they took all, like I said, all these concepts from different areas of the United States, and allowed districts to pick or use a combination of those methods. There's lots of districts out there that use a combination. So what the legislature did is it basically said, hey, here's current groundwater law in the United States for the most part, and you get to pick which one works for your local area. It's, essentially local control at its finest. What works best for you? So the language used in that 36116 are things like managed depletion, historic use, production limits, acreage-based, and then also reasonable use, correlative rights. Those are the concepts that come from that language I mentioned in 36. But what's interesting about 36116 is it doesn't specifically say these concepts that we now borrow, which are reasonable use, demand-based districts that aren't based on surface acreage ownership. The surface acreage ownership is what we call correlative rights, and then there's districts that use a combination of both. So like I mentioned, that list is there, and it's nice to be able to look at and say, okay, and there's also the authority to use a combination of those methods.
Thanks for that, Kristen. And then when we are looking at correlative rights, what are the legal concepts that come into play there? Things like fair share and some of the language from the Day case, for example. Can you speak to that?
Right. And actually, as I was preparing for this, it dawned on me, y'all, that the Day case, the Edwards Aquifer Authority versus Day case, came out in 2012. So it reminds me, it feels like it was yesterday, but that's been 11 years ago at this point. There was a lot of speculation when that case came out, and I think, at least from an attorney that represents groundwater conservation districts, not much has changed for the GCDs out there. Not much has changed. What the Day case said is it uses the term fair share. It does not define what that is. It actually, I think you could argue the language used in the case pretty much blesses the Chapter 36 system. I think there might be some that would disagree with that, but I do think that there is some language in there that we could certainly rely on when we need to say that using these different approaches is blessed. In fact, one key point in the Day case that I think is helpful to know is essentially it said that the way that the administrative law judge that was interpreting the EAA rules, the way that the administrative law judge and then EAA interpreted and applied those rules was consistent with state law. So I think that's key, that essentially all the GCDs that I'm familiar with, I don't read all the hundreds of rules or close to 100 rules. I don't read those, obviously, very often. But the point is I've never seen a set of rules in recent history where I say, that doesn't comply with 36. So that's not really our challenge. Our challenge is the takings concept. And that's what is essential from Day, is this taking concept. And the two big things we have to really worry about in this takings concept is, investment-backed expectations. We hear about that all the time. What somebody invested in the property and how they need to use groundwater in order to realize that investment. And then also the economic value or the economic value lost if they're denied that property right of using the groundwater.
Thank you for that. So that kind of sets the stage from the legal perspective. I would like to hear a little bit more on the technical side, James. When we are talking about correlative rights, can you provide us some context about some of the physical characteristics of an aquifer that come into play?
Yeah, so when you think about aquifers in Texas, you've got the Ogallala and some of those West Texas aquifers that are large, unconfined aquifers, and it's easier to envision, hey, the water's probably going to be under a certain property or acreage or tract, and it's moving a little, but not a lot. And then you get to karst systems where water moves pretty fast. The Day case was interesting that happened there. But essentially, then you move to parts of the state where you've got confined aquifers. And so confined aquifers, essentially you've got, for the same amount of pumping you would have in an unconfined aquifer, you're going to have a much larger cone of depression and water level impacts much further away than you would, say, in an unconfined aquifer like the Ogallala. And then you've got the karst systems that the water's here today and it's on the neighbor's property tomorrow and moving, very quickly sometimes. So all of those concepts need to be considered, and I'm preaching to the choir. All of you districts and board members know that your local conditions are very important to how you manage and how these concepts are brought into rules. But those are just some of the, aquifer types, characteristics that need to be considered as you, move into management with correlative rights. And so I think as you look at the development of some of the rules across the state, you definitely see in the beginning with the older districts that, in the Panhandle and Ogallala districts, where this technique and approach was applied, and it makes a lot of sense, right? In certain other areas, it's a little more difficult because of the technical differences in the aquifer. So I just think there's a lot more detail to it, and I think Kelley's going to get into some of the details of what they've done, and Britney as well. So anyway, I'll leave it there, but there's obviously a lot of technical differences across the state that need to be incorporated into any kind of rulemaking, whether it's correlative or demand or whatever. So.
All right, thank you. All right, so now I would like to move into a little bit of a discussion about some of the ways that districts are approaching correlative rights. And I think I'll start with you, Britney. Could you just share with the audience how Panhandle allocates and what their permitting approach is when it comes to groundwater?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, James. I'm glad that you think that the way we do it in the Ogallala makes sense. It makes sense to us too. Our Panhandle district covers 7 counties. The main aquifer is the Ogallala, and our main use is agricultural use. So we have an operating permit process where it is tied to the acreage that you own or have the legal authority to operate. So if you have 640 acres, our allocation is 1 acre-foot per contiguous acre owned or leased. So you can pump 640 acre-feet annually. It's very simple and rooted in our data.
And how is that working for your district in terms of your users and your management?
I would like to say that we are pretty successful. So like I said, it's simple. So when you sit down and you're talking to a permittee, odds are they're going to know what their acreage is. They're going to be able to tell you where it is, how much they own, or they have the legal authority to operate. So it's simple and it's straightforward. I think it's personalized yet impartial. So we have the opportunity to sit down with these permittees and we can talk through their operating permit, which is basically their plan with them. It gives us an opportunity to learn from them, to talk to them about what their crop rotation is, or if it's a municipality, we can talk to them about how they use rotational pumping. It's a time for you to sit down with them and learn from them, and then also educate them on what you're doing. I say that it's impartial because we apply it to all water users the same. Everybody gets up to the 1 acre-foot per contiguous acre owned or leased. I also say that it's rooted in data because 94% of we have about 650 operating permits across our 7 counties. 94% of our operators are in compliance with the 1 acre-foot. So that's not to say we don't still have work to do. We are not finished. We're always looking to improve the process, but I'm pretty happy that 94% of our operators are in compliance with the 1 acre-foot. That makes me feel like we are in line with our current needs.
And you said up to 1 acre-foot per acre. What is that up to 1 acre-foot? Is that an aquifer characteristic issue, or why would that happen? That they wouldn't get the full 1 acre-foot per acre?
Yeah, that's an aquifer characteristic. So we will grant the permit, and it's, again, based on the acreage that you own, but I can never guarantee you that you're going to be able to produce 640 acre-feet. And that's just an example. It's obviously tied to your acreage, but we always say up to because I can't guarantee that you can pump that.
Thank you. And then, Kelley, I'd like to turn to you and hear a little bit about what Guadalupe County does in terms of their approach to permitting. Can you tell us a little bit about that and provide us an overview?
Sure, yeah. Guadalupe County is a lot different than Brittany's county because we are very small in comparison. We are we're not even half, we're 2/3 of 1 county. So she's got a lot more land to cover there. We have two aquifers there, the Carrizo and the Wilcox, that we are authorized to manage, or dictated to manage, I suppose. And we treat those aquifers differently. Just as James spoke to earlier, not every aquifer has the same characteristics. So for the Wilcox aquifer, we gave up to 1/2 of a foot per acre allocation of water rights. But for the Carrizo, which is why y'all wanted me to come talk today, we do things a little bit differently there. The Carrizo, our board decided to look at it from a 3-dimensional saturated sand thickness perspective and allocate a portion by a policy decision, that water that sits underneath each parcel over the Carrizo aquifer. So, and by policy, we actually set a cap, an annual production cap, that we use to determine the amount of the annual permits that we will issue for the Carrizo aquifer. And it's important because Guadalupe County, we are largely an outcrop area. So we are charged with managing the outcrop, fully aware that the water is being pulled at a dip underneath us and moving constantly. And so part of that decision to set a cap is to base it on that protection of the outcrop area. And that annual production cap that they set, it roughly equates to the annual recharge to that area. And so that's an important factor when looking at the outcrop protection, which is something that our board takes very seriously.
Thank you for that. And can you talk a little bit about how that relates to the DFC that your district has adopted and the MAG?
Sure. We work closely with our GMA counterparts, and we set up monitoring wells throughout the GMA. And working with our other districts, we're able to continually look at water level declines, pumpage production, permits that are issued in various counties. And so we're able to look at that to be sure that we are, in compliance with our DFC, because one of the DFCs for our area is management of the outcrop.
Thank you for that. And I want to jump ahead, actually, and ask you, James. Kelley mentioned the outcrop. Can you speak a little bit to how, these considerations with both, down dip, up dip portions of aquifer play into decisions about how to go about permitting and correlative rights? Right.
And so, excuse me, then in the confined portion of the deeper Carrizo, Gulf Coast, other confined aquifers, you as I said earlier, you've got, more impact for the same amount of pumping that you potentially would have in the Ogallala or an unconfined aquifer. The TWDB actually has a really nice one-page summary of this on their website. And so as those water level impacts move to the outcrop, a lot of those have a different impact in the outcrop, or they may be, but depending on the aquifer, everyone's different, but they may be slightly, hindered from moving into the outcrop. In other words, the water level decline or the drawdown that you see in the confined zone may not have as much impact in the outcrop or unconfined zone because of the change in the storage properties of the aquifer and the recharge and many other factors. So it's all location by location dependent, and that's what Kelley was saying about their approach to looking at recharge and then the wedge-shaped Carrizo and how they try to tie all of those factors together to come up with,
the best available science.
The best available science. Thank you. So
that was perfect. I want to go back to you, Kelley, for a minute. And so now the way you go about permitting, all of the groundwater is allocated, even if someone hasn't come in and asked for a permit yet, right? I mean, you've allocated it to all of the landowners. They know the portion that they can get.
Potentially, yes. We publish the water right availability on our website, and so by our district rule, we are constantly updating the model, constantly updating it, not just from a policy perspective, but absolutely by a science perspective. And those water rights are available. You can go to our website, look alphabetically by your last name, or look at by the appraisal district's parcel ID and know exactly how much water is out there for permitting, for leasing, or what the landowner owns.
Thank you for that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about implementation. And Brittany, maybe you could just talk a little bit about some of the practical considerations when you're implementing your approach that are front of mind to you and that you really are focused on.
Sure. So when the board decided to adopt this policy, your brain as a manager or as a staff member starts going to, well, how is this going to work practically? How are we going to implement this with the landowners or the operators in our district? And so some of the things that come to my mind when I think about this is you need really good data, water level and meter usage data. Those are going to help validate the decisions that your board is making, and then it's going to help you move forward as you evaluate to make sure that your allocation is still correct for your area. Another thing that you need is a well-functioning database. So we track landowners and operators. We track their acreages. So you may have a landowner who has several different farms. You need to know where those locations are. He may have several different wells. He or she may have several different wells, the meters that are associated with those wells. So it needs to be a sophisticated database that can track all of these things and then report that usage, because that's going to be very important to the water users. Another thing that I think you need is a very strong education program. You're going to need the support of these stakeholders as you move through this process. They're the ones who are making the day-to-day decisions that are impacting your aquifer. And so you want support from them, and they need to have a good understanding of your rules, of your DFCs, and ultimately your goals. And then last, that was very helpful for us, is we had an amazing staff who was able to step in. So we gave ourselves 1 year to do operating permits across the 7 counties. So it was about 600 permits at that time, and everybody in our office knew that operating permits were your job until that year was over. So we all had to work together, and that really helped us grow as a staff, so our staff understood our rules thoroughly as well.
Kelley, I saw you nodding your head a lot when Brittany was talking. Do you have anything that you would like to add with respect to implementation?
Ours is different in that our board did this right from the beginning. So we were established in 1999, and by 2003, we had already adopted our Carrizo saturated thickness model. So we started with this policy. We started with the correlative rights for the Wilcox at 1/2 acre-foot per surface acre. But I 100% agree with all of the information you just said about needing the data and everything to keep it going.
Okay, and now, you mentioned having started from the very beginning. I want to turn to you, Kristen, and talk a little bit about, well, what if a district wanted to change directions in terms of how they were permitting and allocating groundwater? What are some considerations that a district would want to think about?
Yeah. So I think the legal and practical implications here intersect. And for those that would convert, in other words, weren't a correlative rights-based system that essentially either did reasonable use, this also applies to new groundwater districts where the demand, the growth, the density came prior to the regulation. That's in a lot of your populated counties. That it's difficult. I don't, from a legal perspective, feel comfortable doing that without some sort of historic use-based approach. In other words, we would grandfather in prior users that were reliant upon your system. If you don't have some variation of that approach, I think that you run the risk of some of these takings claims where, and actual valid ones, where investment-backed expectations become a huge issue. But if you implement it with a historic use aspect to it, that essentially could go away in many respects, the investment-backed expectations. Also, that economic, what the economic harm is, that's the other consideration too. And as we know, I mean, you mentioned before, and 94%, I think you said, of compliance, when you've been established for a number of years and your regulated community is used to a particular regulation, and then you essentially completely pull the wool out from under them, you have those, I mean, that's such a huge challenge. So like I mentioned, I think that it certainly would need to have a historic use component to it as well. I know with Kelley, y'all are a wonderful example, Guadalupe County is, of having done the regulation in what is now a dense area, becoming more and more so populated area, prior to when the growth came. In other words, their correlative rights approach came before, and the regulation came before the actual density did. So I think that's a wonderful example of now you are a correlative rights-based district in a populated area, but the regulation came first. That's very important.
So I'd like to reflect a little bit on the why. Why did your district, Brittany, opt for this approach? Because it has now been in place for 25 years.
Parts of it.
Parts of it
has.
Quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking back, why was this approach chosen? And I would also love to hear how it relates to, because over time, obviously, districts have now had to adopt DFCs and the MAG, and how those fit together.
So I say parts of it, and because in 1998, when we adopted the 50/50, the 1 acre foot was rooted in that plan. But we did not have the operating permit process until a few years ago. So we worked through a completely different set of rules, basically from 1998 until 2018. We had a different process where we were looking at acceptable annual decline. The problem was that the data was just telling us a different story. So we had these study areas and conservation areas. Within our study areas, we kept seeing decline within the thinner portions of the saturated thickness, but the pumping was outside of our study area. That's what was forcing this decline on the inside. So we weren't ever really pinpointing the problem area. And so that's why our board kind of moved to this other permitting system of everybody gets up to the 1 acre foot, and it's just a more, I think, fair way to do it. It's more impartial, and it applies across the board to all of our water users. So that's really where the change came from.
And could you just, for the folks that don't know, explain the 50/50?
Oh, so it's our 50/50 goal is our DFC, so it's a 50% of volume in storage, 50 years.
Thank you. And Kelley, how about you? Now, you guys adopted it from the very beginning, and I know you weren't there, but it was in the history of the district and in the story. What drove that?
I believe that our board was looking for a fair and equitable way to distribute the water rights, and I think that they saw the uniqueness of the Carrizo sands in our area to do what they chose to do. We did, I should say that we're mostly public water supplies in our area, and we did have one historic use user that applied for historic use and was able to get historic use through that, but the majority of the development happened after the fact.
James, turning to you, and we were talking about implementation, are there any other considerations that you would like to flag when it comes to implementing a program that a district would want to be aware of?
Well, I think Kelley just brought up an interesting point about, your user base, and I compare that to Brittany's and how different they can be. And I believe the more history a district has in regards to, identifying their water resources, modeling them, trying to quantify, how much they can use to meet their DFC, I think it makes it a little, there's just more factors to consider from a technical standpoint. Even our groundwater models don't always address to the level of detail everything we need to look at to, I think, make the tough decisions. And as you said, Brittany, I think I think we agreed that, the Ogallala or an unconfined, easier aquifer to characterize is a little bit potentially easier for everyone to visualize how this works and how to move into the future. I think in more complex aquifers or confined aquifers with deep pumping and different uses, I think all of that makes it a little bit more difficult to try to work through, the devilish details. Yeah.
Kristen, do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, I think overall, as you can tell in this conversation, James, and we've had a lot of conversations, I think all of us have, essentially about how we take those users and we try to do what, the districts are really trying to do within Chapter 36 the best we can to make sure that we are trying to be fair and equitable. And I think the bottom line, as you can tell, is doesn't necessarily mean correlative rights is the answer. It's not the answer for everybody. It can certainly be a very, very important part. I mean, it is key. In the Day case, for example, the Day case does talk a lot about correlative rights and how in the oil and gas context that is a big part of the fair share concept. The Supreme Court goes on to say, though, that it's not the only way a groundwater district. And that's the key, I think, is really important takeaway for people here today, is that while it is absolutely, I would say, like I mentioned earlier, blessed by the Supreme Court correlative rights as a regulatory tool, that it's not the only one, and the Supreme Court also said that as well.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to talk a little bit about correlative rights heavy, I guess, James. The version that Robert Mace defines when you do have it associated with the MAG, and you're focused on the total volume that is available. Right. What are the challenges in determining that total volume? You know, where might there be snags or challenges in that type of an approach?
Well, we know that the science is always being improved, so that's a good thing. The models are being improved all the time. Hopefully, the data that the districts are collecting is becoming, you know, more prevalent and, you know, more representative and more critical to making hard decisions about groundwater management. And so all of that's happening. You know, I don't know. Adaptive management is always, I think, you know, a part of what we see in the joint planning process, just like we do the regional water planning process. And so I think those changes, when we go back to the hard, you know, the hard, what did he call it? Heavy. Okay, the heavy correlative rights. Essentially what I think what he's talking about is, you know, this move over time to changing the allocation with a correlative right to something that does get to the MAG, which helps you achieve your DFC. And I think, you know, we see everything across the state from a hard implementation of those correlative rights to something that's much looser and will probably have to be adjusted through time. So from a technical, I don't think there's as many technical challenges there as there is policy challenges, and a lot of that, you know, gets back to, you know, historical use and development of rules over time and the economy and all of that local wisdom that's tied up in groundwater management. So.
Kristen, do you want to comment on that?
I think it might be a question for James, really. Do you see how monitor wells, in other words, when we're taking the policy of take the MAG and divide it up and essentially apply that in a correlative right system, we know that actual use, not necessarily permitted volume, is something that is a concept in what we do. And how do you see monitor wells, I guess, James, I think, because from your technical perspective, how do you see that as being an important role in how a correlative rights-based approach would work?
Right. So obviously, all of that good monitoring data is critical in, you know, monitoring DFCs and your approach to those DFCs out in the future. And so super critical. And what I always say, some people may disagree, but, you know, the modeling is just a predictive tool to help us look into the future as best we can. And the real data in the aquifer is obviously, you know, going to tell us how we're doing with all the uncertainties in the modeling and all of our, you know, assumptions about use. I thought the Arizona presentation was very interesting in that regard. They thought they had it all figured out, and they just left out one sliver of assumption that made a big change, or made a big difference. So.
Can I ask you a question too, James? So about the heavy correlative rights, that assumes that there's water availability everywhere in that space, and so dividing up the acre feet, you know, equally doesn't mean that you're gonna find water there. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think y'all made a stab at trying to address that, right? And so I think in some aquifers that's a lot easier than others, and I think I'll let Kristen, you know, comment on all of the, you know, private property rights issues and everything else that come up when you implement a system like that. I think obviously there's some, you know, unknowns or questions about all that yet. So
So
or not.
No, go ahead. Yes.
Right. I think that, yeah, it's back to, we have to focus on what those investment-backed expectations, economic, value, or what we're missing. I think a good example is, though, when we're thinking about it like that, because that's really our challenge for districts is, okay, let's make sure we're achieving this balance that we all hear about, but it truly is what the takings law is. It's a balance. And sometimes it works in the favor of the regulator, the government, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think a good example that we're seeing a lot, James, I know we are seeing a lot for some of our clients, are HOAs, for example, that want permits for irrigating, essentially landscape irrigation, sometimes to put it in a pond. A vanity pond is what we call it. But when you look in that example, when you look at, okay, what is the economic value that they lost? It's really only the difference between what they would pay the city that they actually could get that from, that water from, that per thousand gallon fee, and really it's actually it can be relatively low. They obviously come to the groundwater district to get water because it's cheaper, but when you look on in a grand scheme of a year, then you look and see, well, and technically speaking, it's not that much. So the economic value there, that's an example of what the court would look at. What would it take to make you whole? Okay, if you can go to the city to go get water, right down the street, for not a whole lot more money, then in reality that economic value isn't that detrimental. In other words, it's in favor of the groundwater district.
And this is kind of related to what you're saying. If you have a system in place that does not really take into account that total volume of water that's in storage. And so over time, the allocations, you're going to have to start making space for new permittees that come in, and you perhaps need to claw back or cut back on permitted volumes. What are some of the legal issues that come up there? And relatedly, how is it best that you approach someone who doesn't want to produce if you're talking about a correlative rights type system?
Exactly. One thing, again, I think we want to base that decision to claw back or restrict production on a correlative system to actual what the monitor was. In other words, we need the science to show us that. We don't want the model. Models are fantastic, but they're tools for long-term planning for the most part. So I think we would certainly want actual data, monitoring well data, things like that. That would make me, as the legal practitioner, the most comfortable that we have actual science we're basing those clawback decisions on. I also think incrementally. In other words, if our goal is to get down from 2 acre-feet per acre, for example, down to 1, let's go incrementally over a course of however many years, 10 or whatever we feel comfortable with. Again, using your hydrogeologist to say, okay, like James says a lot of times, how do we get on that bell curve? How do we get on that curve to be where we want to be? It might not be next year, but in 10 years, if we can achieve that, similar to the DFC over the 50-year planning cycle, if we can achieve that over the course of 5 or 10 years and get where we want to be, it makes a lot more sense, I think, from a legal and practical perspective to do it that way, slowly, as opposed to changing it overnight. I think that's important.
So, Britney, in hearing Kristen talking about that and answering to that question, what is your district thinking about any of those issues currently?
We're thinking about it, but we're not there yet. At this point, we're implementing the 1 acre foot, and it's working for us right now. Of course, maybe some point in the future, that's going to have to be looked at, but we have something in place in our rules already that allows us to evaluate the allocation as often as we need to.
Thank you. Kelley, do you have anything to add on that?
It's also in our district rules. Annually, we look at the allocation, and we look at the science in the model and put any updates in it. So if we were needing to make those decisions, it would be something that the board could take a look at every year.
James, anything you want to add on that? Clawbacks? No, you're good? Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it right back to you because we're coming near the end of what I pulled together for this panel last night at 8 o'clock.
You're doing a great job, by the way.
I just would love to end with some reflections or tips that you would give to a district that wanted to explore this. Where should they start? What should they be considering? Who should they be talking to? And I'm just going to go down the line and give Kristen the last word.
Well, obviously, as a technical person, I'll just stress that. You probably have a really good idea of how your aquifer is responding to demands. You're monitoring, you're understanding your system better, your models are improving over time, you're getting better information. All of that needs to play into how you're, considering either modifying your correlative approach or implementing it or whatever. And I think a lot of the districts really are, for what, thinking back to what, Kristen said, the private property rights issue is huge. And this is Texas. It should be, right? So we're Texans. So that's the bottom line for a lot of people. That's a huge consideration. And that gets back to that policy, difficulty, I think, in making changes moving forward. But all of those technical, all that information that you have about your aquifer and the models, all of that can be helpful, I think, in making really hard choices moving forward. So I'll leave it there.
Kelley?
Science, 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 more science, and then policy.
I think I liked what Kristen said, where you can have these kind of hybrid approaches. So I don't think it has to be all or nothing. I don't think our correlative rights type permitting approach is the silver bullet. I think that you can mix and match, and it can be created and developed in a way that works for your area. Now, I really liked what Dr. Overman said earlier about the human agent is key. I believe that. I think you need to be engaging with your stakeholders, with your water users. You need to be educating them because they're the ones who are making those day-to-day decisions that are impacting your aquifer. And so I guess that would be my tip, is to kind of start slow and move through the process and educate as much as possible along the way.
One thing that I think we can do as groundwater district practitioners and those of us that are working with our water utilities, a lot of y'all that have correlative rights systems are seeing, for example, the rural water entities that are seeing growth and then don't have the acreage required to meet their customer demand. And then on the other side, they have a requirement in law to meet that demand. What I think we can be doing, because I'm seeing a big void in this, is I think that we can be teaching them, hey, whenever there's a development coming in or where there's somebody with any kind of acreage, have that developer or that person turn those groundwater rights over to the utility. That is something that sounds as very basic. Believe me, it's not happening as often as it should be. So for example, for a 1,000-acre subdivision that's coming in, have those groundwater rights turned over to the utility. In other words, so that 1,000 acres is now the utilities that they can use for correlative rights, that they can use for permitting. Otherwise, and I know in this area this has been a challenge quite a bit. Otherwise, you have an issue of if there's a well on that property, who technically did the utility have the right to utilize that? That's coming up now in this area quite a bit. And then also, in the future, the utility doesn't have to work with it. So that's a little tidbit I'm seeing when I'm representing rural water entities that we are really focusing on. And I think we can all spread the message of let's get those water rights associated with all the development that is coming in our state.
Thank you for that. So with that, I would love to open it up to any audience questions for our panelists. If you wouldn't mind stepping back to the mic that's behind you, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so when you have folks coming in and applying for permits based on leases, what procedure do you use to ascertain that the lease is valid and that over a period of time they maintain them? I mean, sometimes we have people who let some leases go during the permitting process, et cetera, and I wondered if you have a procedure that you go through to ascertain that.
That's right. That's a great question. What we do is we evaluate the lease and confirm that we think that they own or control, is the language, own or control the groundwater rights. If there's a certain time period associated with that lease, we will put that in the permit and say that we understand the lease associated with this right or this permit is, it has an end date on it, and we would put that in the permit essentially so that, we acknowledge that either they have to come back in and prove up the ability to control the groundwater. And so that's practically speaking how we usually go about it.
Brittany or Kelley, do either of you have anything to add on that?
Our district does that the same way. Our permits are issued for a 5-year period, and we do a water allocation, a water rights audit every time. And so when the permit comes up for renewal, we make sure that all of the water rights that were attached to the original permit are still there.
Allison?
So I see the appeal of correlative rights, the simplicity, the perception of it being impartial. But thinking about Brittany's example of a farmer who owns a section who gets a foot per acre, immediately I was calculating, okay, so he can farm half of that. A municipality that owns 640 acres, it really doesn't matter to them. They'll just use the water. So is it really impartial? Because you think about the impact to a farmer per section about how much of that he can actually grow a crop on versus a municipality that's not even using the surface and they're just using the groundwater. And that question is not directed just to Brittany, but I'm using her example.
Any of you want to tackle that one?
I'll start. So, I mean, essentially, as far as the equitable side of it, we are saying we don't necessarily care what your use is for the most part. It's that whether the acreage is owned. So in other words, if the city owns 640 acres, that essentially the impact, of their pumpage from that aquifer based on, say, for example, a 2 foot per acre approach would be the same as the farmer based on acreage owned. So that's what I call a pure correlative rights. I know I differ a little bit than Dr. Mace in terms of my thoughts about what pure correlative rights. That's just a pure, acreage-based approach with no other considerations involved in it. But so with those, now with others, I know there's some systems where we take the retail service area of those of the cities, and the law actually says in Chapter 36 we can do that. And that's something I think is, luckily that's in there. I know that's been controversial for a number of years. That's one reason why I mentioned, practically speaking, let's work with those utilities to go get that acreage so we don't have to have that argument as much anymore. But I think that for the city, though, they do actually they can either own the acreage, own and control it, lease it, or they can utilize their retail service territory, subtracting out other usage within that area. Anybody else?
I think I just was meaning that I view it as impartial because we apply it the same across the board to all water users. As long as you're not wasting it, you get the same allocation is what I was meaning by that.
And our permits are issued for any beneficial use. And so if you have the water rights and it's a beneficial use, you can take that up to our board for consideration.
Ron?
In fairness, he was ahead of me.
Okay, he was, all right, Justin.
So here's the question. I just kind of want to pick up on Robert's, correlative rights, heavy, light conversation here. So if you don't, we heard a lot of, okay, half an acre foot per acre, right? So the question becomes, what are you tying that volume to, right? And so if you don't go with the heavy approach, right, tying it to the MAG, what are the panel's thoughts on sort of recommendations or best practices for what you do tie that to, right? I mean, we heard a discussion of recharge, for example. We heard a little bit of discussion about storage. And then I'll add on to that, if you think about storage, how would you handle some of those sort of aquifer differences that we've talked about? How would you handle an aquifer where that storage is, say, 300 feet down, or where 99% of it is 3,000 feet down? So what are your thoughts on best practices and recommendations for what to tie those numbers to?
Who's going to tackle that one?
It sounds like a James question to me.
I might have been thinking of James with this.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think the districts are always trying to improve their science, right? There's always going to be uncertainty, even in the most difficult situations to apply this. I believe, I think there's some real magic in the joint planning process from the standpoint of it's adaptive. And when we don't have all the best science, when we don't have all the best information, we still can adapt along the way. And so everybody takes a different perspective on that. Some people think they should lock in. Some folks, are planning for that variation. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. You want to ask it a
Not,
different
not
way?
yet, yeah. Well, so, I mean, so if your district, right, and you say, okay, I've got these folks and I'm trying to come up with this correlative rights schema, right? And I'm saying, I need to know X acre feet per year per acre. How do I fill in X? If it's not tied to the MAG, what is X coming from? Is it coming from recharge? Is it coming from storage? Is it coming from some other mechanism? What do you think is the best approach for that?
Well, one thing I would mention, actually, because Brittany, you and I were talking about this, you know, one consideration I think that you mentioned with your district was the use. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes, so our main use is agriculture, and so we feel like the 1 acre foot is really, it's representative of that. Is in line with their current need. It's a little more conservative than what I think that some of that 6% that's not in compliance with the 1 acre foot would want, but overall it kind of matches that need that we have.
Justin, I think it depends on which aquifer you're talking about too. You know, they're all so different. It's going to depend. I guess to borrow from Greg Ellis, he always says it depends. It depends on which aquifer you're talking about.
They answered the question better than I did, Justin. Thanks.
It depends. I think that was the best answer. Thanks, y'all.
All right, Ron, you're up.
Okay. I sat through this expecting to hear a correlative wrong, and I'm not sure that I heard one. So I'm going to throw something out here that I've calculated out and see what you think about it. I've looked at the acreage in Blanco County. I've looked at the total of 4 different MAGs for the different aquifers in Blanco County. And without boring you with the math, the equal share per acre would be 395 gallons per month. That's a total of 4,739 gallons per year per acre. I would say that's a correlative ridiculous or a correlative wrong. So I guess my point is that I've heard everyone's talking about huge numbers. Huge numbers. Now this would work out fine, maybe, if someone had 1,000 acres. If you've got 1 acre or 5 acres, you don't even have enough to have a household of 2 people, probably. So I just see that there's times when correlative rights will not work. That's my personal opinion. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just doesn't work. Now, we could increase that. If we double the MAG or double the DFC, then we would have just under 800 gallons per month. So you're not really helping that much. So I think it's just something to keep in mind that correlative rights seem to be beneficial when you've got a huge amount of water available or you've got huge properties. But for somebody with 5 or 10 acres, it's probably not going to work. And I love to be corrected, but I think I'm on solid ground here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming your math is right, and that's
hope.
the math that works out for a lot of districts. Yeah. And I think there's some hard decisions to make moving forward, you know, if growth continues to happen, especially in the hill country.
Well, I've looked at it a lot. Looked at it when the Blanco Panhandle Groundwater District got started, and the math just didn't work for us. And so we went with reasonable use, and that has its own problems. But I think that Robert would have been right if he had said correlative light, correlative heavy, and correlative wrong. You'd have 3 categories probably. That's all I got, unless you want to roast me.
Thanks for that, Ron. I was sitting here just thinking, mirror, mirror on the wall, no one approaches the fairest of them all. To your point, they're all fair in their own ways, perhaps. Well, let's give this panel a round of applause.